In this video, we're going to talk about two laws that govern the human body that'll help you better understand femoroacetabular impingement or hip impingement and help you get hip pain relief if you have these allegedly bad bone shapes. These two laws are well known, they're in medical textbooks, they're not anything I made up, and they will help you get relief. So stay tuned through the whole video so you understand how you can apply these laws to get your hips feeling better. If you're ready, let's get ready to think right, move right, and feel right. I recently had a discussion with physical therapist Garrett, who has hip impingement, and he talked about hip impingement bone shapes and what they mean and don't mean. Here's a quick clip so you understand what we're talking about.
The bone shapes you have were probably a strategic element of your biology. You know, it's laying down this bone for a reason. You know, if you came up in, as an athlete doing cutting sports, all this shifting around in the joints, your bones are responding to that just as your muscles do to load. You know, if there's a lot of impact in a day-to-day, in a sports specific way, a lot of load going through those bones, it's going to respond by laying down more bone to restrict that direction.
Now what Garrett just said is that the bones of the hip joint might be growing in response to the loads being placed on them. And this isn't some sort of weird sci-fi fantasy. This is actually based on the first law I want to talk about in this video, and that is Wolff's Law. Wolff's Law basically states that bone is going to adapt to load. That means if you are constantly loading a bone in a certain way, the bone will actually grow. It'll get denser and start laying down more bone to respond to that constant stress. So if you're constantly hammering in like this, you might see bone start to grow to create a little more resistance, a little more stability to motion there. The opposite is also true. If you don't load bone, the bone will get less dense and will get weaker, which is how you end up with osteoporosis. So when you think about hip impingement bone shapes like cam and pincer, you're talking about bone being supposedly overgrown. And if it's overgrown, we need to think about why it's overgrown. Hip surgeons will say something like, oh, it's congenital, or it's just a bony defect, it's just the way you're made, but that's not the case, and that ignores this basic fact. Bone grows based on how it's loaded. This is literally in medical textbooks. So the idea that these tiny little variations in bone shape are the reason your hips hurt so much is highly suspect for many, many reasons that I've detailed in other videos. So Garrett's main argument is, hey, if you are seeing overgrowth of the bones here, then that's probably because the muscles that control the way these two bones interact are not doing their jobs properly, which means you need to figure out how to use the muscles better to have more stability and more flexibility where you need it, rather than continuously hammering the same movement patterns that are causing loading in a way that causes more bony growth. And that's assuming that these little bony overgrowths are even the cause of your pain or even causing hip range of motion issues. Remember again that very flexible people can have these same bone shapes, have no loss of range of motion, and still have hip pain. So the argument that the bone shapes and the bone overgrowths actually stop your range of motion is highly suspect. It's a lot more likely that the muscles are limiting your range of motion because they either can't lengthen or they don't have the strength to stabilize you in different positions. Which brings us to the second law, which is Davis's law, which again is in medical textbooks, and that is that soft tissues like muscles will adapt to the stresses and the loads placed on them. The reality of this law is not debatable. If you've ever lifted weights, if you've ever lifted something heavy for a month consistently, you will have noticed that your muscles have changed. They start to get stronger, they get a little denser, they start to be more capable of doing the thing that you're trying to get them to do. Whatever the load is, the muscles will gradually adapt to that load and change. And if you don't load a muscle and you just let it lie limp for a couple months, guess what's going to happen? The muscle is gonna die. So when we think about your hips, we need to remember that it's not just about the bones, it's about muscles that wrap around the pelvis and the femur that help control the way the femur and the pelvis interact. And if you haven't been training the muscles to do their jobs properly, they won't be able to do their jobs properly. Most of us are sitting so many hours a day that the muscles around the posterior hip are basically trash. And for many of us, the strength and flexibility of the muscles of the inner thigh is also trash. The strength and flexibility of your hip flexors that create this motion, also trash. We're just doing a whole lot of this all the time, and that means that the muscles all around our hips are just plain trash. So to review, we have Wolff's Law, which states that your bones will grow based on how they are loaded or not loaded. So if you have some sort of overgrowth, it's telling you that there is some loading going on there that might mean you need to pay attention to your muscles. And the muscles, according to Davis's law, will adapt to the loads you place on them. So if you stretch them and teach them how to be longer and stronger when they're longer, it's going to change how your hips feel, and it's going to change the range of motion that's available. If you train your hip muscles to be stronger in certain positions, it's going to make a whole lot of difference to how your femur and your pelvis are able to move in relation to one another. All of this is why I tell people to ATM, always think muscles. Your muscles control the position of your bones, and if you work on your muscles, you will be able to get your bones moving appropriately in relationship to one another. If you learned something from this video, drop me a comment down below and let me know what you learned. If you're looking for a program to help you rebuild your hips at home, go to uprighthealth.com/DIY and check out the Healthy Hips program, and you'll also find some special information specific to you if you've got the hip impingement diagnosis. It'll help calm your mind so you can rebuild your body. I also encourage you to check out Garrett's website and YouTube channel. I will link to those in the description box down below. He's a great resource, especially if you're an athlete with a hip impingement diagnosis. Like, share, and subscribe with the bell notification on. And as always, I hope you remember that pain sucks, life shouldn't. Every time